Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have an interesting program. I'm absolutely sure you're going to enjoy it. My name is Mel Katten. I am happy to welcome you on behalf of the Board of Trustees of Roosevelt University. I have been a member of that board for 33 years. I was never a student at Roosevelt, but I've always supported and believed in their principles. I remember when my cousins came back in 1945 from the war and couldn't get into college because there were quotas. They were Jewish, obviously, like I am, and they couldn't be accepted. They had to wait 1 and 2, 3 years to get into the University of Illinois and other schools. And I just never forgot that. But Roosevelt never applied those principles or limitations, if you will. So it's in my mind, even though I was never a student here, I've been always so delighted to be a part of it and supportive and believe in the mission of the school and the outstanding faculty and the outstanding administration of this school. I have been an attorney in Chicago for my entire career, starting in the year 1964. And so I obviously put in a few years here. I also want to remind you that after this discussion tonight that you're going to hear, there will be a reception and a book signing just outside in the foyer. I would like at this point to welcome Professor Heather, Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Mansfield Institute for Social Justice and Transformation at Roosevelt University. She will introduce our speaker, Professor Danielle Allen, who I know you will very much enjoy. Thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to Heather.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? So I am so happy to be on this stage with Dr. Allen. And I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we'll get into a discussion.
You're going to call me Danielle, right?
And then I will call her Danielle.
Okay.
But first, Dr. Allen earned a PhD from Harvard University in government. Dr. Allen earned a PhD, I'm not stuttering, from King's College, Cambridge University in classics, 2 PhDs. She has written or co-written 7 books, and she has won more awards than the number of books she's written. She is the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University, the Director of Harvard's Edmund Safra Center for Ethics. She's a political theorist, she's published broadly, and she's a regular contributor to the Washington Post. And tonight we're here to discuss her most recent book, Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A., which is the story of her cousin, Michael. So Danielle, I'm wondering if we could just start out, if you could talk about how this book came about, how you decided to write it, and just give us some context.
Sure, no, thank you, Heather. I'm very happy to be here as well. Thank you very much, Stuart Warner, wherever you went, for the invitation.
There he is.
There we go, in the very back. Thank you. And thank you to my friends who've come out this evening as well. I appreciate it. It's always good to be back in Chicago, which is a city I love. So Heather did invite me to tell you a little bit about the book before we jump into conversation about it. My baby cousin, Michael, was 8 years younger than I am, and we grew up together, 5 of us, myself and my brother, and then Michael and his 2 siblings. We were all sort of 18 months apart from each other. We were in a big extended family, and we were a sort of close subset of cousins within that family growing up in Southern California. Michael was, I'm sad to say, arrested when he was 15 for an attempted carjacking in 1995 in Los Angeles. It was his first arrest. I should say from the get-go, it is, in no sense can one feel good about, wanting to say, okay, look, I'm here to talk to you tonight about, my beloved cousin, the attempted carjacker. There's no way that formulation can ever feel good. I want to just be very clear about that. And at any rate, it says his first arrest. In the police report, the victim reported that Michael held his gun pointed down the whole time. And in fact, the only good thing to be said about the incident is that his victim got his gun from him, wrestled it away, and shot Michael through the neck. So that's how the attempted carjacking ended. And Michael was the only person hurt in the incident, thank heavens. And it's a terrible thing to say that about your beloved cousin, that you're grateful that he was the person who was hurt. On the way to the hospital, he was rushed in an ambulance to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, without any adults around, et cetera, he confessed also to having robbed 3 people the previous day and somebody a week earlier. So one has to admit straightforwardly, it was a spree. It was the first such thing. There had not been anything like that in his life experience up until then. It was 1995 in California, just 18 months after the 3 strikes you're out law had been passed, and so he was told by the judge he'd confessed to all of these. That was 4 felonies. Well, 2 came from the carjacking itself, and then 2 robbery felonies. That if he were convicted on all 4 of those, he'd be facing 25 years to life. Alternatively, he could take a plea bargain. So he did. He pled guilty, and he got a sentence of 13 years, 12 years, 8 months, and he served 11 years. He was released when he was 26, and I was, at the time, here in Chicago, actually, as Dean of the Division of Humanities at the University of Chicago. And I had been working with Michael during his time in prison on college courses and support and so forth. And I was, as I call it, the cousin on duty when he got out. So I was in California that summer. I was with his mother and sister on his release day. And I had the job then of helping him with reentry, working on housing and schooling and job and so forth. And things seemed like they were going well, but Michael's life ended 3 years after his first release, page 29, 2009, when he was killed by the transgender lover he'd met in prison in that period between 15 and 26. And that, as I said, was 2009. And the whole thing was a quite traumatic episode for my family. It's taken me a long time to make sense of it. I was invited by Professor Henry Gates Jr. at Harvard years ago to give at Harvard a set of lectures called the Du Bois Lectures. It was a sort of famous lecture series named after W.E.B. Du Bois, the great sociologist from the early 20th century. And the point of these lectures at Harvard is that the person who gives them is supposed to be addressing the question of African American life in contemporary US. And I kept giving Skip these abstract titles. I'm going to talk about race and justice in the 21st century. I'm going to talk about political equality and African Americans in the 21st century, and so forth. And I kept deferring. The dates would get closer. I'm like, I can't do it. I'm not going to give those lectures. Finally, I got to a point where I couldn't keep postponing. Skip said, kid, you're going to have to give these lectures. And as I thought about it, I just realized that there was no way I could possibly pretend to talk about what has happened to African Americans in this country in the last 25 years without telling my cousin's story. So that's what I've done. And it's called Cuz, because he was my cousin, that's what he called me. And because I was trying to answer questions. Why was he dead? Why had he been in prison for so long? And most importantly, why had he ended up at 15 standing on a street corner holding a gun trying to take somebody's car? He has a big extended family who loved him. His immediate family was poor, but there were resources within his family. What happened? So the book is an attempt to answer those mysteries, and it's an accounting of Michael's life, but my hope is that it's also a lens into the bigger questions about what we've done in this country with the criminal justice system, juvenile justice, and the kinds of opportunity sets that face young people growing up, especially in urban areas in difficult, challenging city contexts. So that's what the book's about.
It struck me as I read the chapters that in answering the whys, that it's also a book of discovery. And so helping the reader to discover the humanity of the people that we're incarcerating. So it's the unique story of Michael,
Right.
but he's symbolizing the 2 million or more others who are incarcerated. And it was also a process of discovery for your family. So if I might, I just wanted to read a section and then ask you to talk about what that discovery was for your family.
Sure.
And so Michael has now encountered the criminal justice system, and that means that your family is encountering the criminal justice system. So Danielle writes, Michael came from a family that believes that if you do something wrong, you face the consequences unflinchingly. His family was one that still believed in the reasonableness of the criminal justice system. At each turn, the family learned too late that the criminal justice system was no longer what they thought it was, that its grip was mercilessly tightening, that our son would be but one among millions soon lost to its vice. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to just talk about what that process of discovery was for your family. How did that play out in the way that meant that you interacted with Michael and each other and yourselves in your relationship to what was unfolding?
Well, I mean, I think one of the strangest parts of the experience was the way in which a group of competent people could become incompetent. That is to say, so I'm an academic. My father's an academic. My mother's a librarian. My brother is turned into, he's a Boeing corporate executive, so Boeing, that's your company here in town. And my dad is from a family of 12 siblings, and other brothers and sisters were also in Los Angeles. They were competent people. One uncle owned his own camera shop, another aunt who was a college-educated activist in the Bay Area and organizer. Michael's mother by then was a nurse, so her life was always a life of struggle, the struggle of a single mother working very hard, but she got things done. She got herself a nursing degree. So it's a group of people who, at some level have a sense of efficacy in the world. And literally at every point, sort of in the first instance, the first key decision was that Michael would be tried as an adult rather than as a juvenile, and we were caught by surprise. And then the use of the 3 strikes law for a juvenile being tried as an adult facing his first arrest caught us by surprise. But again, it happened, and then we understood it was happening. And sort of over and over again, I mean, even to the end when he was getting out, so we had worked up, a variety of plans that would have permitted him to move elsewhere. So my husband and I in Chicago were ready to take him here and support his education here. Family in Riverside County, which was where he was last in prison, and he'd been fighting wildfires. He'd had one of the sort of inmate firefighters, had the terrific experience of growing and developing through that program. And there was family in Riverside County that was ready to take him, and we were sort of building all these plans and working on all these plans, and then boom, sort of 9 months before he's going to come out, we learn, in fact, you have to be paroled back to the county in which you committed your offense. And we can't figure out a way to get around that requirement. And so, again, years later, I feel like there must have been a way, like we just didn't find, the right lawyer, we didn't find the right kinds of resources and so forth. But, so what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that the criminal justice system, in addition to the problems of the excess in penalties that we have, is simply hard to navigate, like, even for college-educated professionals. And you have to let that register to understand the kind of trap it is for so many people who encounter it. It is just surpassingly difficult to encounter the criminal justice system and find ways to make healthy, meaningful interventions in it.
And then what did that mean sort of for how you experienced your relationship to Michael? I'm imagining being in court and you just want to go up and give him a hug. He's your cousin. But there's this system there now that's mediating all the relationships.
So I wasn't there in court. I was a graduate student in England at the time. His mother and siblings and other aunts and uncles and cousins in Los Angeles were there in court. But it's true that for his mother, one of the hardest parts of the first moment where they made the decision to try him as an adult was that she had gone to court that day expecting that he would be released to her custody, as would have been customary for juveniles. And instead, there went her baby back into the van to go back to prison. And at that prison, you couldn't touch the inmate. So they would have, when the parents came, siblings couldn't visit. So Michael, was arrested when he was 15, and then was, it took almost a year for the whole process to complete itself. And in that time, his siblings could never visit him. Only his mother. She could hug when they got there and hug when they left, but they couldn't touch in the intervening time. And Karen, her name, describes that as the single most painful feature of the first phase of that experience, of not being able to hold her baby.
And it seems like Michael was, from what you're writing, just a wonderful kid, super engaged in the world. And
yeah, I should have said more about that. I should have introduced you to Michael, which I haven't done yet. So Michael was really a very extraordinary person. Talented, bright, joyous, his gigantic smile. He's like, the youngest child of the family's youngest daughter and the beloved sort of baby of the family. Precocious, did well in school, very curious, loved being outdoors, was sort of a wanderer in outside spaces. And you asked about the process of discovery for my family, so let me say a little bit more about that and about Michael. So he was also a very talented writer, and there's sort of a great essay about Dante's Inferno that he wrote during his college classes that's at the center of this book. And when he was released from prison at 26, our hope was that he would tell his own story, that he was acquiring the tools to tell his own story. And so then when he died, that was another feature of the loss. And so I began to feel like I had the job of trying to figure out how to tell Michael's story. So in some sense, my book is just a setting for Michael's essay, which is at the center of this book. But in order to write the book, I needed to do lots of interviews with family members and so forth. And so this speaks to the kind of incapacitating nature of the experience. It's a terrible thing to say, but the fact is, it wasn't until I started working on this book that we talked about what had happened to Michael. Any of it. So we were all wrestling with the why questions, the ones I started with. And we had never talked it through together. And this is because of shame. These are shameful experiences, and people have a very hard time breaking through shame in order to talk directly about problems of this kind. And once you do, you just kind of everybody's got a little piece of the story, and you start to put it together. You can actually work out the puzzle. You can understand what happened. I can explain to you now. I can tell you the why of what happened to my cousin. But that matters to me because, coming back to your point about sort of just how many, there's 2 million people in prison right now, or 2 million people in prison last year, and 2 million people in prison the year before. Obviously there's overlap in those groups. It's not 2 million different sets of people, but still, there are just millions of voices and stories that aren't being heard, and stories that families aren't putting together because it's shameful to talk about being in prison and having family members in prison. But I think if we actually want to address the question of the criminal justice system that we've built, we've got to bring the stories to the surface so at least we can all see what's been happening.
Absolutely. And I think one of the stories that there's so much in here about Michael's life that's bringing these stories to the surface. And it does, the fact is that when people enter the criminal justice system, they're dehumanized and flattened, right, and isolated from their relationships. But Michael found love within that context. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because, there is this, he found love in this space that's so dehumanizing, and what that means.
Can I just read a little bit of his Dante essay, and then I'll answer your question, and these things will relate to each other. I'll just read 2 little sections. The Inferno is constructed like a prison. It is especially similar to the 8th circle. The souls are in pits which are guarded by beasts and demons. They are being punished in accordance to their sins on earth. Prison is the same way. The sins we committed as citizens are judged according to law, which is based on universal principles. We who are in prison had to answer for our sins, and our lives were taken from us. Our bodies became the property of the state of California. We are reduced to numbers and stripped of our identity. To the state of California, I am not Michael Alexander Allen, but I am K10033. When they want to know anything about me, they do not type my last name into the computer, but it is my number that is inputted. My number is my name. I am K10033. And I'll just read a little bit from the very end of it as well. And like Dante, I am forced to descend lower into hell to achieve a full awakening. I am forced into depression, scarred by obscenities, war after war. But each war that I survive, I am a step closer to a full awakening of self. My hell is no longer demonstrating what I am capable of doing in order to survive. It has become what I can tolerate and withstand in order to live. I cannot help but to judge those around me. I am one of them, but we are far from the same. Like Dante, I am cursed with a spirit of discernment, which allows us to see the truth for what it is. There are most whom I despise who are truly sick beyond healing, and they should never leave this place. Then there are those who await to fulfill their destiny. I see in them a sincere and apologetic heart for their ill misdeeds. They are the ones who will change the world positively, or positively change someone's world. Hell cannot hold the latter of the two opposites, but in time will only spit them back out into society to do what is right. The hell that I live in cannot hold Dante. Hell can test and try oneself, but it cannot hold Dante, and it will not hold me. In the inferno, the dead are trapped forever. Surely the biggest and most important difference in the inferno and my hell, called prison, is that I have a way out. So I read those passages to answer your question because I wanted to read the one about being a number, which I think was Michael's way of conveying the experience of dehumanization that you were describing. But at the end of the essay, you can also hear his voice giving an account of a kind of resilience, a way of thinking about a future. And he did fall in love in prison, and he called me. I mean, I remember the occasion vividly because he called. He said, this with prison call, they always start with, will you accept a collect call from California Department of Corrections? And you say yes. And like every 3 or so minutes, like, this is a collect call from California Department of Corrections. They kind of constantly remind you and interrupt it. But we were talking, and he said, I've met someone, Danielle. She's beautiful. And I was like, what? Like, aren't you in a men's prison? And then I thought, maybe it was one of the guards, because there were women guards. I'd met some women's guards when I'd visited him, and he carried on, and I realized it was a fellow inmate, and I came to understand what was happening, and his voice was completely different than any other call I'd had with him. I mean, he was most definitely in love, and it was a permanent bond. It was, in the end, the bond that killed him. But the thing that's funny about it is this was happening at the same time that he was working on these college essays, and he wrote this essay about Chaucer and about the Knight's Tale and the Peasant's Tale, which are tales about love and desire. And he has these very insightful sort of comments in it about how you can never know what's going to happen to a man because you don't actually understand his desire. And I'm like, this is a great essay about Chaucer, Michael. Like, he was writing about himself, like he was actually telling me about the experience of falling in love. Like, I thought it was about Chaucer, and so sort of, I was really missing, even in the times he was communicating to me about what was going on with him. But it was a genuine romance, one that Chaucer helped him to explain.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind just sharing what you think about. I think that currently prisons and the way that they dehumanize, to find love in that space is really something special, perhaps revolutionary, right, in those spaces. But we're also living in a world that is becoming more and more institutionalized and mean and self-interested. And in what kind of lessons can we learn that speaks about a world where we're trying to come together and perhaps develop community and love?
Right. Well, this is, it's certainly the case that, Michael went into prison at 15. He was there until 26. And so I think at the, I just sort of ask people to kind of like stop and reflect, what would that mean for you? I mean, you would fall in love. You just would. And then your question is exactly right. I mean, what is love like in the context of a prison? And in Michael's case, he had the bad luck of falling in love with somebody who was violent, had a history of violence, and was in the end also violent in relationship to him. But nonetheless, they did give each other a great gift. I am confident of the fact that this love made survival possible for Michael inside the prison. And so, I am grateful for that. And I never asked him any questions about the relationship. He said, he hadn't told his mother about it. He was afraid that she would judge her. He's like, I didn't think you would judge me, Danielle. And I just was so relieved to hear a level of peace and contentment in his voice. And it was absolutely from this experience of choosing somebody and being chosen by somebody in an environment where everything else, there just was no choice. Everything else was constrained.
So kind of want to flip to the other side of that and talk about hate a little bit. Yeah, so you talk about a system that's built on hate. So what I'd like to do is just read a short passage and ask you to talk a little bit about the unforgiving world that we've created. You talk about, since antiquity, mankind has known that anger drives retribution, the desire to make someone pay. When punishment fits the crime, anger sates itself. It modulates, it softens. This is what makes it anger and not hatred, a distinction recognized by philosophers all the way back in antiquity. Hatred is distinguished by its unending quality, its rigid fixity, and the pervasiveness to softening, the imperviousness to softening. And then you go on to say that to offer to give a 15-year-old 15 to 25 years, you say, is one of the purest expressions of hatred I can imagine. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And actually, I want to say that Stuart has disappeared again. But Stuart asked me before this, he said he thought this book connected to my early work on punishment in ancient Athens, and he asked me if Aeschylus was in here. That's where Aeschylus is, Stuart, is in that passage. I read it to go with that. So there's an epigraph to part 3, which is called Unforgiving World, and it's from Robert Frost. I'll just actually read the whole, you all know the Frost poem, I'm sure. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Fire and Ice, it's called. And that poem, beautiful little poem, is a compression of all of Dante's Inferno, in which fire and ice also work that way. And Michael thought about those concepts of fire and ice and desire and hate. And so spoiler in terms of what do I figure out, I mean, the answer is Michael perished because of fire and ice. He perished because of his own desires, because of illicit desires when he was 15, the desire to steal this car, and he also perished because of hate, because of the criminal justice system that society had built, which meant that the sentence that he got in no way gave him a meaningful second chance. And the idea of the forgiving world is one that I took from two economists at Harvard, as it happens, Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, who wrote this great book on education called The Race Between Education and Technology. And they argue in that book that one of the things that has characterized the American educational system until pretty recently and been a thing that made it great was that it was a second chance or forgiving system. That as kids could drop out or screw up, and there would still be another way in through the community colleges or the GED program and so forth. And that this has been distinctive of American education and contrasts to other parts of the world. And so I started thinking about the criminal justice system in relationship to what they had argued about education, and realized that was a way of characterizing what has happened. I mean, the three strikes law says it directly. It sounds like it's forgiving, right? Because it sounds like it's your third chance, but they used it on his first arrest, right? So it's sort of like, it's not a forgiving system. And there are so many different pieces of the explanation for this. It's been completely bipartisan. Like, both parties have absolutely contributed to using mandatory minimums in sentencing and a ratcheting up of penal sentences. But I also, it's sort of a long answer here, but this is also in which the war on drugs matters. I have a long list of reasons why I think the war on drugs has helped build the unforgiving world, but one is just very simple. If you think it makes sense to put somebody in prison for 1 year to 2 years just for possessing some marijuana, of course, proportionally speaking, everything is going to shift up in a really dramatic way. It's like, that anchors, the illogic of that law anchors a complete shift of the whole penal system. And so the point I'm trying to make there too, is just spell out one other thing about it, because this is sort of like arguments in the sort of philosophy of punishment. You'll hear often, actually, that what happened in American punishment is that we moved from having a rehabilitative system to having a retributive system. And so my book is a little heterodox. I'm saying that's wrong, actually. That's wrong, because retribution, rightly understood, is proportionate. It's eye for an eye. Like, the punishment fits the crime. He had the gun pointed down, he didn't hurt anybody, he got shot. It was luck, it's true, but it was also first arrest. Proportionality there, not 13 years, maybe 4 years, I don't know. But the proportion is the problem. But what had happened in American punishment is that we had become deterrence theorists. And what we were targeting was not a single specific offender and specific victim and their circumstances, but the number of carjackings that were transpiring in Los Angeles at that time. So by the time of Michael's arrest in 1995, there had been like more than 2,000 carjackings in Los Angeles that year. Like, that was the object of the laws against carjacking, not any specific individual. And interestingly enough, like, if you dig into the history of philosophy and theories of punishment, and you look at a figure like John Rawls, a very famous American political philosopher of the 20th century, his argument is, the problem with deterrence is that if you're gonna if that's your reason for punishing, well, then you just like lock people up before they commit crimes. You lose all sense of proportion and clarity about what punishment is actually for. And what it's actually for is indeed retribution, which tethers you to get into a kind of limit of proportionality. So that's my argument. We've become fully deterrent to the degree of not actually even being retributivists.
It's interesting, too, to think about deterrence in a system of white supremacy where there's a sort of a double standard for how blacks are treated in the criminal justice system versus whites.
Yeah, I mean, the criminal justice system has all kinds of wrongs inside of it. There's no question about it. And, you can sort of go down the list and find comparable cases where sentences are much lower, and then the relevant distinction is the perpetrator's race. So that is another thing that has ratcheted up penal severity.
Yeah. So how does this inform, we're here at the American Dream Reconsidered conference, and how does it inform our understanding of the American dream?
So let me just come back to the fire and ice idea for a second, okay? Because this is actually, this is one of my core points. And I find that people don't always register it on the first go. You did probably, because you guys are, this is Chicago. This is like smart town. But, you all know, as well as I do, that our conversations about these issues tend to split between the people who say it's about individual responsibility. Michael clearly failed to be responsible. He did a wrong thing, that's that. And in the sort of charactered version, people say it's the system, it's structural injustice, he was the victim of a system. And my point is, it's fire and ice, my friends. Yes, he was responsible for his actions, but everybody acts within an opportunity set that they haven't themselves built. Who built Michael's opportunity set? His family. We bear responsibility. And the society that instituted a set of laws that have destroyed the urban core of Los Angeles. And I could say more about that, as well as a set of laws that have produced excessive penalty in the criminal justice system. So again, we don't have to separate the story of individual responsibility from the story of societal responsibility. They both kinds of responsibility pertain. And I like to think about it in terms of, I don't know if you guys watched the Olympics last summer. There was that Indian gymnast, Kara Makar, something like that was her name. She was doing this crazy Russian maneuver. I can't remember what it was called. It's a Russian name for gymnastics maneuver, but the news was like this was this incredible degree of, it was the highest degree of difficulty of any gymnastics maneuver. And the question is like, was she going to be able to pull it off, or was she going to break her back? Like, you either pull it off or you break your back. And that's, I think, what the situation is for young people growing up in tough, especially neighborhoods with gangs in the inner city. Yeah, there are people who can do it, okay? You can overcome those circumstances, but most people are going to break their backs. And it's we as a society, adults, who are responsible for the degree of difficulty that young people in those circumstances are facing. Thanks.
And so with that said, and as a sociologist, I so appreciate those words. Yeah. So where does that leave young people relative to the American dream? And if I could also add in, Michael had a disability, right? He had ADHD. And about 80% of juveniles in the system, and the high estimates, right, have disabilities. So, it's sort of this other piece where, as a society, we're not attending to that. Rather, we're pushing them away and institutionalizing them.
Yes, the question of how we think about mental health in this country is also a huge one. Again, see, this is, so let me just back up a couple steps to say two more things, if you don't mind. So one about Michael and us, his family, and then one back to the issue of mental health and society more broadly. The thing that went wrong for Michael, and that, such that he ended up on that corner holding the gun, is that when he was 10, his mother, after she'd been working her way up as a single mother, got a nursing degree, got herself and her kids into a little house, starting to pull things together, married a man. And the man turned out to be abusive, and it just blew everything apart. And so in the ages between 10 and 15, Michael changed schools 5 times, most of those being mid-year changes, with the last move being into Los Angeles from outside of LA. And you go into LA as a 15-year-old where you don't know it, nobody knows you, you're not a known quantity, and you're asked to prove yourself. And it's just a dangerous equation. It's almost like laws of physics. And he was isolated and disconnected in various ways, and this is what he encountered. Anyway, go into that more. But the point of saying all that is when his home life had that kind of instability, why was the world that he encountered so very dangerous? And the answer there goes back again to the war on drugs and how we have handled drug control policy. Now, what on earth does that have to do with mental health? I think, my hypothesis is that our problems with mental health are very closely connected to our decision to make illegal marijuana and to treat all narcotics use as criminal activity. Why? A lot of people are self-medicating, all right? And when you're self-medicating and it's criminal, you don't ask for help, you don't get proper treatment, and the whole sort of paradigm for thinking about what people are doing in this world is a criminal justice paradigm, when it could be a health paradigm. It could be about harm mitigation and addiction treatment. And other places have tried this. Portugal, for example, legalized marijuana and decriminalized harder drugs. That's an important distinction because it means things like cocaine and heroin are still illegal, but you get a misdemeanor, not a felony. So they're not life-altering in that way. And the result of and then also Portugal was, for that reason too, able to shift resources to attacking the traffickers at the highest level, not trying to sort of attack users or small level distributors. The result of this effort in Portugal has been an increase of people seeking treatment and decrease in adolescent drug use. Why? I mean, again, it's just a hypothesis. I can't prove it, but my hypothesis is because they're building a world where people think that the issue is a health issue, not a crime and punishment issue. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I'm saying it's sort of connected to mental health questions. I mean, I think we're partly bad at dealing with mental health precisely because we've treated narcotics as purely a crime and punishment question.
Right.
We could be treating it as a health question.
Mm-hmm. And when we look at our prisons and the rate of incarceration around the drug issues, it's just, we could basically empty the prisons if we, could address this as a health issue.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, you can get me going on this subject. Sort of people are going to hear more than they want on this, but I mean, the basic facts are, I mean, I know some of my friends, have heard me say some of these things before, but I always like to ask the question of who knows how much money Americans spend on illegal drugs every year? Put your hand up if you know. Yeah, see, this is, which we kind of should know, don't you think? The answer is $100 billion, right? Like, none of us know that. That's what it means to have an illegal black market, but that means like it's $100 billion worth of positive desire for narcotics that Americans are expressing with their activities, what economists called revealed preferences. The revealed preferences of Americans are that we are the single biggest consumer of narcotics in the world. That's the fact of the matter. Yet even so, we refuse to admit that about ourselves, and so we build this incredible criminal justice system. So, yes, if you just took nonviolent drug offenders out of American prisons, that would reduce the population by 14%. That's sort of a drop in the bucket, you might think, except that you have to add on to that then the violent offenses that flow from the black market and the amount of violence that's just connected to having a black market of that size. And then you have to add on to that the fact that so drug filings are the single biggest kinds of filings in federal courts, for example. So just to pick one year in 2013, new filings, 32% were drug-related cases, to give you a sense of like the workload for prosecutors that come from drug cases. So the whole system is built around the drug piece now. When prosecutors have these kinds of workloads, police report that it makes them much less willing to take, say, homicide cases that aren't open and shut. And this is one reason people suggest that homicide clearance rates have fallen so dramatically, well, in places like Chicago, for instance, Detroit, Los Angeles, but it's like in the middle of the 20th century, homicide clearance rates in this country were 90% on average everywhere. Now they're down like 60%, 50%. Detroit, they got down into the teens around the period of the bankruptcy. When you have low homicide clearance rates, the whole rate of violence shifts up. Not just because people think they can get away with things, but because in an environment like that, if you know that somebody can shoot you and get away with it, the best defense is a strong offense. And so everybody gets trigger happy, okay? So prosecutors, if they could spend more time on homicides, working with police, not worry about drug cases, we might actually be able to bring down levels of violence. So there's all those crimes that are represented in prison that also flow out of the distortions of the war on drugs. And then there's the final bit that I mentioned before, which is if your anchoring sense of proportion is 1 year to 2 years for possessing small amount of drugs, then every punishment shifts higher, longer, and there's more people in prison because their sentences are longer. All right, so the war on drugs is distorting along a number of different dimensions.
So I would like to ask you one more question and then open it up to you all to participate in the discussion. And this comes from one academic to another.
Yeah.
So when we write as academics, we can actually put some distance between ourselves and what we're writing about, and we can be very scholarly. And you have amazing scholarship that preceded this book. But this book, you really stepped into it. There's no distance. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what that felt like, and then what was the dance you had either prior to writing it or that you're having now with your family because you've written this?
Sure, and I'm happy to address that. Can I read just a little bit more
Sure.
to respond to this point as well? Is that okay? I'm going to read you a little tiny bit of a chapter called Visiting 1.0, which is about visiting Michael in prison. And my editor didn't like this chapter, but it's still here, you'll notice. But in a minute, I'll tell you why I'm reading it. I'll explain this. As Michael, known to the system as K10033, wrote, inmates went by numbers, not names. And visiting days were allocated to sets of numbers. Half of the evens on one Saturday, half of the odds on Sunday, the other halves of each set the following week. Before you could even begin to visit, you first had to apply for permission to enter. You had to get your name on the list. This could take months. And then the visits themselves were odysseys. We generally set out at about 4 or 5 in the morning in the half dark of pre-dawn and drove straight toward the rising sun in order to get to the prison by 6:30 a.m. There we would join the line of waiting cars snaking from the parking lot past a row of suburban baseball fields that bordered the prison. This was a good time for heart-to-hearts between Karen and me. At 7:30 a.m., the guards would let a parade of Kias and Hyundais, Chevys and Dodges into the parking lot. And then you would sign in at a lectern at the front of a canopied structure with wooden benches that looked something like a tent revival meeting. Hosts of mainly black and brown women, but white women too, and many children, and some men, flitted in the shadows under the canopy. We could take in up to $30 in quarters or singles in plastic baggies, and we always took the maximum. The point of this was to purchase treats for the inmates from the row of vending machines dispensing, as it turned out, quite disgusting microwavable cheeseburgers and burritos along with mystery meat plates. It also mattered how you dressed. You couldn't wear blue denim because that's what the inmates wore. You couldn't wear beige or khaki because that's what the guards wore. You couldn't wear tight clothes or clothes that showed cleavage, or skirts shorter than 2 inches above the knee, or sleeves shorter than 2 inches below the shoulder. If you were dressed wrong, you weren't let in. You always took a backup set of clothes just in case. If there was a focal point of the control, I suppose it was the attempt to target desire. All right, so my editor didn't like this chapter, and he kept saying, you're not telling us about yourself. You're not in this chapter. I'm like, what do you mean? You know, I got all this detail. I'm being so precise about the experience. What are you talking about? And it took rounds and rounds of going round before I realized that up until this point in the book, I'd been writing the whole book saying I. And I don't know if you heard it, but in this passage it says, I say you. You take in plastic baggies, you take in bills. And I was like, oh, that's what's going on. I couldn't talk about myself, actually, in this experience. So I wrote Visiting 2.0. And I'll just read a little bit from here. I thought I needed to keep the chapters together in order to make the point. Now, I will have to try again to describe what visiting Michael meant to me. The fact that I told the story as an academic, abstraction and distancing, already tells you everything you need to know. That wound of visiting Michael in prison goes so deep that somehow, even in writing this book, I have found it hard to own up to one simple fact. I went to prison. I was in prison. No, I don't mean that I have been arrested or convicted of a crime. I have avoided that because thus far in life, I have had that combination of goods that the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle thought was necessary for a happy life: resources, decent character, and luck. My father and mother gave me the first 2 items from that treasure chest. The Lord my God, whom I believed in as a child and then did not believe in, and then came to believe in again as I emerged from periods of great pain, has given me the third. All right, so now you know more about me than anybody other than my husband. my second husband, that is. Our wedding took place barely a month before Michael's murder. But no, I was not in prison as a convict, and this is thanks to my father, my mother, and my God. Yet even as someone who could come and go, I felt the prison's mark, its branding fork. I felt it in my soul, even though all I was there was a day's sojourner. So anyway, this is to your point. It was very hard to find out that what I needed to say in my own name and my own voice. I'm an academic for a reason because I don't like doing that. But I also came to understand that the sort of being an academic is kind of an excuse not to own some of the pain that as an academic you sort of go around the world encountering and writing about analytically. And that this is a mistake. It's even an intellectual mistake because your heart, I think, is a powerful discovery instrument for discovering the questions that matter. Your head, you need to answer the questions and you should be as rigorous as possible. But it's fine that your heart should identify the questions to ask. So in that regard, working on this has been a sort of liberating project for me to find ways of thinking about how to put heart and head together in an academic context and to try to make the case within the academy for the need to put heart and head together. And I believe that in many ways our research agenda at universities would evolve faster if it were easier for people to put heart and head together.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I welcome you all to ask questions. Are there mics on? There's a mic over here, so you could, and a mic over there. So if you raise your hand, they can bring the mic to you. And I just want to say before we go into Q&A, there will be copies of the book for sale in the entrance and a book signing to follow. So we have about a half hour for Q&A. Yes.
Hi, welcome back to Chicago.
Thank you.
Not many scholars have the ability, the audacity, the following to write a column for a major American newspaper. So I'd be curious to hear, why did you agree to write the column, and what's the hardest part of writing that column?
Oh, wow. Well, I think I have a bad habit of getting myself into things before I really understand what's entailed, kind of like writing this book, actually. So I kind of find out, actually, sometimes what the challenges are afterwards. So why did I do it? I had things that I wanted to say. That is, I think of writing columns actually as sitting at the dinner table of our national conversation. And I grew up in a family that liked to have dinner table conversations with the kids being expected to chip in too and stir the pot a little bit, see what direction the conversation should go. And it's like, this is my way of sitting at the dinner table for a collective conversation. And I am really lucky. I have an extraordinarily flexible relationship or arrangement with the Washington Post, so I don't have to write if I don't want to. And if I have something to write, they'll publish it. So and that for me was the secret that made it work. If I actually had a deadline that I had to make every week, I don't think I would ever have been able to do it. But because of not having a deadline, I'm like 3 pieces a week. It's just sort of, it comes somehow, so. The hardest part? I guess, a couple of things probably. One is, this is a very polarized country, and it's sad, and finding two, and one is just maintaining your sense of purpose when there's a heck of a lot of incoming fire that doesn't seem to take the time to actually even read what you've written is its own kind of challenge. And also, I am a person who, I think the polarization is bad for us. I think we need to overcome it. In various ways, with everything I do, I'm trying actually to get us out of that polarization. And coming up with things that feel like they might contribute to that is very challenging. So there's a gentleman right up, maybe one more right in the front row, and then we can bounce to the back, or a couple more in the front row, and then,
So the American dream is this idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you achieve success. And I was wondering if you would say that the American dream is really up to the individual or to the society he's in, and the social status and the legal system and economic system, and also for people who completed their sentences in prison, what are the odds that they can achieve the American dream as any other citizen?
so the odds are low, and we just know that, right, from basic statistics of reentry. And I mean, it's just a horrible thing, but we can all see this day in and day out when we move around the city, and you see the wreckage of lives on sidewalks. Like, that's what we're seeing. I mean, my guess is probably 90% of those individuals that you see sleeping on the street have a criminal record. That's my guess. Like, I don't know that for a fact. Somebody probably knows that. Do you know the answer to that?
I don't, but it's also kids coming out of foster care, aging out.
Right. Okay. Both of those things. But on the subject of the American dream, so I guess I would give it a slightly different definition. And this is, again, my friends in the audience will know that one of my obsessions is with the Declaration of Independence, of all things, which helped me a lot working on this book. Is thinking about the Declaration of Independence that's led me to my crusade against the war on drugs. And so this means I have to explain what I'm going to say, I have to recite the second sentence of the Declaration, so forgive me. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. That's the American dream. We institute our government to secure our rights. And that framework of rights matters because it creates the opportunity set that we encounter. We can only pursue life, liberty, and our own pursuit of happiness, or have life and liberty and pursue happiness, within the framework of a legal environment. And it either supports that pursuit or it hinders it. The war on drugs is hindering life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in this country. So the American dream is about two kinds of responsibility. It's our individual responsibility to work hard, play by the rules, but those rules had darn well better secure our rights. And if they don't, the American dream is broken. Do you mind if we do one more in the front row? Because I have a friend who's come to share the evening with me.
Hi, Danielle. Very interesting. My question is simply, your cousin sounded like a pretty good kid, a talented young man.
Yeah.
My question is, what motivated him to commit the crimes that he committed?
Sure. So I have another cousin named Peely who grew up just blocks away from the neighborhood that Michael landed in when he was, moved back. His mom moved him back into LA, 14 and 15. Peely, I'll say one other thing too. So there's a third meaning to cuz. I didn't even know there was a third meaning to cuz until I started working on this book. The third meaning of cuz is it's what members of the Crips call each other. All right? Now, my cousin Peely, who grew up blocks away from where Michael landed, grew up in a Bloods neighborhood. Pee-wee did not gangbang. I said to Pee-wee, how does this work? He said, well, here's how it works. Basically, if you come up in a given neighborhood, you're just known to be a part of that gang. It's like he was understood to be a part of the Denver Lane Bloods. But because that's just where he was from, and that was the attribution people gave him, he didn't have to do anything to prove it. And so he could kind of like move along the sides of the thing and get out and be safe. But when you come in as an unknown person, you're asked to prove your affiliations. And Michael, it turns out, and none of us knew this, none of us saw this, was flirting with both the Bloods and the Crips. Like, that's a really crazy thing to do, okay? Really, just dangerous. Anyway, there was an older person with him for the incident of the attempted carjacking. Michael confessed everything on his way to the prison, except he never mentioned this other young man. Never. And so, I don't know this, but to me it reads as an incident where he was protecting this young man because of concerns about gang affiliations. So the short answer is Michael was making a decision about whether or not to affiliate, had reasons to be driven in that direction, and this was a part of that process. And when I did research in the sociological literature, you have to tell me if this is right. I looked into the question of how do young people come to be involved in gangs. And the first thing to know is that the gang landscape is actually quite diverse and differentiated. It's not all gangs sell drugs. It's very diverse. And in Southern California in the 1990s, there were some gangs that all they did was party, and other gangs that were mostly interested in sort of vehicle competitions, hot sort of drag race, whatever, just a variety of things. Go back to the 50s and 60s and think West Side Story, and that's sort of where gang life starts and comes from, and then it evolves over the course of the 20th century because of the war on drugs, but it's still diverse in the 90s. And so my cousin Rosalind, Michael's sister, joined a gang. It was not a kind of gang-banging gang, just to have protection from bullying in school. Same thing. Michael needs protection in the world that he's in. But how do you get protection? You get protection by agreeing to participate in these kinds of activities. So it's those, what I was going to say about the sociological literature is what I found over and over again was an account that young people start flirting with gangs in sort of 10 to 13 year age range, and about 18 months after they start flirting with gangs, they have their first arrest. Fits Michael to a T. That is exactly the timetable of what happened.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you very much. I've appreciated everything that you've said. Very thoughtful. I wanted to ask, I understand the war on drugs and the elevation of the reference point for criminal justice, but I wanted to ask somebody has to make the laws. You referenced this in your Declaration of Independence that you just recited. Somebody has to make the laws. So what takes rational people and has them craft and create a law that turns a criminal justice system into a blunt instrument where it shouldn't be? Is it news cycle, re-election politics? What is it that takes what are seemingly rational, smart, competent people in Capitol Hill and does this? This has always been my thing about that 3 strikes and you're out rule. I'm just curious how that happens.
Yeah, I think the answer's probably got to be sort of like a perfect storm of all of the above. So it's re-election politics, but it's re-election politics against a backdrop of a certain kind, right? Because we've had re-election politics throughout our history, and yet starting in the 1970s, we had this massive upward march. So if you just look at the kind of number of mandatory minimum sentences the country had, the number barely changes between 1776 and sort of 1960s, and then it starts marching skyward. So I mean, there's Michelle Alexander's argument about the history of race in this country, and I do think that's a part of it. There is also I add the war on drugs to that story because I think the decision to criminalize marijuana alongside the other drugs produced a massive sort of economic black market. It's a long, complicated story, but Nixon started the war on drugs. He broke up the mafia's French Connection, which was the heroin trafficking network that brought heroin from Turkey and through Europe to the US, and that opened up the market to South America. And that sort of economic shift in how the narcotics industry was organized brought a lot of violence with it. And it also got entangled in all the wars in Central America and South America in the 80s. So the whole thing sort of metastasized for reasons that people don't have a good sense of, and violence really increased. And so there was a lot of fear, and the media certainly fed into that. So I think for me, you have to put that war on drugs piece and the legislation around that and our approach to that alongside the story about race in America and inequity, racial inequity in the criminal justice system. I think both things are part of the story.
Were you influenced by John Edgar Wideman? He had a brother who was in prison and wrote Brothers and Keepers, and also has a son that served a long sentence.
Yeah, I'm very embarrassed that I haven't read that book. I'm embarrassed because people keep bringing it up to me for all the obvious reasons, and I have to say, I'm going to read it this weekend, I promise. I was influenced by, I can say the books I was influenced by, Jesmyn Ward's The Men We Reaped, which is it's a book also about cousins and brothers. I mean, basically she describes it as, she's a novelist, she's got a new book out just now, I think called All Rising or something like that, so you should go check that out. She's really very talented. Salvage the Bones was a National Book Award winner, but she's from Mississippi, and she sort of had this realization that she was writing stories with happy endings and realized that, like, in her late 20s, half of the men she'd grown up with were dead. And she felt like she had to provide a reckoning of this. And so that was a book called The Men We Reaped. And so that was very helpful to me, and it was a big influence. And then there's also a book by a gentleman named Dwayne Betts, the title of which I'm forgetting right now. He was convicted of a carjacking in Virginia. A few years later than Michael, he got an 8-year sentence. And he is now a Yale law graduate. He's defied the odds. Somebody asked about the odds. And he's doing a PhD at Yale Law. He's passed the Connecticut bar. Connecticut has not as of yet approved him to practice because of the felony on his record. So there's a sort of petition underway. But he wrote a book about his experience of incarceration. And that was also very helpful because it helped me see that the story that I was telling was basically the women's story, the mothers and the sisters and the cousins, because I don't actually have complete access to Michael's story. That's why his letters and essays are so important to me, because that's like my fullest window into his experience. And the reason I don't have full access is, like, even though I was talking on the phone with him for years and working with him when he got out, every call is surveilled, every prison visit is under surveillance, so conversation is very oblique. And then there are all kinds of taboos, like you never talk about what your fellow inmates are in for. It's like you never, hear or learn about all that. And then when a person gets out, like, they do not want to talk about the time when they are incarcerated. So a whole set of things that, like, silence the stories of the people who are actually incarcerated. And Dwayne's book was helpful because it just meant, like, I could take very oblique things that Michael had said, and they made sense. It's like, oh, I see, that's the context that this remark belongs in, and I could sort of start to piece together more of his story. And I made discoveries about things that he'd experienced that way by, like, taking oblique phrases from his letters that I suddenly could understand I wouldn't have understood otherwise. So those two books, Jesmyn Ward and Dwayne Betts.
Hi, I was intrigued by your comment that the USA spends so much on the war on drugs, and
Well, that's how much Americans spend buying drugs.
okay. Oh, buying drugs. Thank
Buying
you.
drugs. Americans buying drugs. Revealed preferences for, like, how much we like drugs. Okay.
Well,
Additional number for how much we spend fighting them.
oh, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
What I wanted to ask is, I've been reading a lot about the opiate epidemic. And I sensed behind your remark that there's an immense shadow around drug use that people do not want to deal with. And my point in this question is that I wanted to invite you to comment on the shadow encompasses like the medical establishment overprescribing these opiate drugs.
Yes. So let me just sort of say one more thing, because sometimes people think it's a little funny that I spend so much time talking about the war on drugs in relationship to Michael's story, because Michael did not use drugs. He was not identified as a gang member when he was arrested by the police. So at the very end of his life, right before he was killed, he was getting involved in selling drugs, but not in the sort of early present life. So people are very surprised. So I just wanted to register that. And it is about this bigger context of the world we've built because of how we approach narcotics. And yes, I think this is back to Heather's point about mental health and health generally, that we are due a reset more broadly, not just in the criminal justice system, but in the medical profession, for how we think about medication. And I mean, it's a big and complicated issue. I mean, there are even parts of the world that don't have access to prescription drugs for pain relief, and where actually, various things that we consider illegal would be the most efficient chance to give poor people in developed parts of the world like meaningful access to pain care and pain mitigation, but it's blocked. So the whole thing is very, very entangled with itself. So yes, I mean, I think the pharmaceutical piece is a part of the quandary, and I do think we should be thinking of them in relationship to each other.
Hi, thank you so much. I can't wait to read your book. Heather asked you about how it felt to be a scholar writing a book that was also very personal. And I was wondering how or what audience you hope to reach with your book. If you hoped that you would maybe be able to connect the community, the policymakers, the scholarly community, like what kind of, or maybe even how that's shaped your conversations and going around the country talking about your book.
Well, thank you for the question. Heather also asked me how this had affected my family, and I didn't answer that. So I should just putting those questions together. This was very much a family project, and my aunt and Michael's siblings have been right there with me through the whole thing. So I spent a lot of time interviewing them and talking with them. And so we all describe it as an experience of liberation and relief and peace bringing. So being able to put the pieces together has been very helpful for all of us in that regard. So in all honesty, I think the first answer to your question is like I wrote it for my family. I think that's just the case. And like I delivered it, the first draft, as a set of lectures because I had to. And it was a very strange experience for all involved because I wept for 3 lectures straight. Like, a room full of lovely people came in for an academic lecture at Harvard University, and the lecturer stood up and started crying, and cried for an hour, talking and crying and so forth, and then came back the next day and I did the same thing again. So people were very, very generous, and that's what I meant when I said I get into things without realizing what I'm getting myself into. I wrote it for my family, and I did the crazy thing of standing up in public and sharing this thing I wrote for my family with everybody.
I don't want to stand up, but thank you for being here. I guess my question, you said earlier something to the effect of you're college educated, you have 2 PhDs, you're an academic, and for you, even the criminal justice system and your family members was really hard to grasp. And I'm thinking about myself as a degree holder, and I'm sitting on a college campus, and I'm assuming the majority of us in this space hold a certain level of social capital, and we're talking about these issues that realistically won't really affect us in terms of the criminal justice system, us being involved in the criminal justice system. How do we engage people who actively are living that life like your cousin did?
So thank you. So one of the things I haven't said quite explicitly yet is this time in Michael's life, between 10 and 15, which was where there was so much instability, that's the really dangerous time for young people. Like, it just is for all young people. We know that, right? We remember what it was like to be an adolescent, and kids that age already don't like to talk to their parents. And then you throw in the kind of illegality of things like marijuana, and it makes it even worse if they're sort of flirting with things of that sort. So for me, one of the focuses is really sort of trying to think about how to do a better job in schools and in other contexts of making sure adults coordinate care for young people. And by coordinate care, I really mean break through the shame and make sure everybody is sharing everything and about what's happening in the life of a given young person. And some schools are trying to do this, they're working on databases that connect schools and parents and other contexts. And when I say break through the shame, I mean, so for example, again, this is a really horrible thing to admit, but my family did not know that my aunt's new husband was abusive until I started working on this book. Okay? People don't like to say they're being abused. And that's just one example. You go down the line, and shame brings silence, and it creates family secrets. And I think family secrets make it harder to care for young people. And all I'm sort of really saying here is we've got to break through the family secrets and coordinate care, especially for young people ages 10 to 14. And one of our big family secrets is the war on drugs. It's none of you even knew how much we spent on it. That's a family secret too. So, it's a kind of abstract answer, but it's I think if we could focus on the age 10 to 14 and really bear down on getting that right, it would go a long way.
Hello. Thank you again for coming and sharing a lot of these things with us. I guess I could entitle what I'm about to say is, where do we go from here? You've brought sociological, legal, economic, educational, and health issues to be approached by so many different areas. Do you know if any movement is really going on to address them? And the second part is, prisons are either conceived to be retribution, punishment, or rehabilitation. What did you learn from your visits there as to the direction that prison was going?
So thank you. Those are important questions. So the 90s were a time when rehabilitative opportunities were being stripped out of prisons. Educational opportunities and so forth were being removed. Prisoners were deemed no longer eligible for Pell Grants and things like that. The good news is there is a movement to restore prison education. I think you're participating in that. Here, colleges all over the country are building prison education initiatives, taking faculty and students into prisons to teach. So we have seen a turn on that one, and it's growing. There's also a turn on laws, and a bipartisan turn. So there are bipartisan efforts in places like Texas and California, actually, to move away from mandatory minimums. California legalized marijuana in November, so did Massachusetts. So there's a growing movement to take apart the war on drugs or reconsider it and try to shift to a public health paradigm for controlling narcotics. So where do we go from here? I think we continue to pursue all of those directions. I'm supportive of rebuilding prison education and so forth, but I don't, know in the sense that's not sufficient because the problem is there's too many people in prison. We don't solve that problem by making sure everybody in prison gets an education. We do need to put education in prisons, but not in a way that makes us forget about all the other work. So there's an organization called the Drug Policy Alliance, which has good information about sort of public health paradigm for thinking about these issues, and I think sharing that with state legislators, for example, is really critical. A thing people forget is that most of the architecture of our approach to punishment is state level, not federal. So it's your state legislators that you need to educate about these issues.
So among many other things, you're also the co-director of the task force of Harvard's Inclusion and Belonging. And with all this consideration that you bring to that and the students, I know the recommendations won't come till the end of the semester, speed it up. But at any rate, what's different about this conversation and dialogue with current students and everybody else who's on that? Because a lot of us are in academic communities, and what's going to move it forward, do you think? I know you can't tell us all of it, but that might be useful for us here.
Right. Well, I've been using this vocabulary of putting head and heart together, actually, as a part of this conversation. That is, well, I'll give you the example I gave in an afternoon of engagement at Harvard with sort of public conversation. So I got to Harvard as a graduate student in 1996. And I got there literally months after my cousin had been sentenced. And I didn't stay at Harvard. It was a hard year. I didn't tell anybody what was going on. And, one of the things, I was there to study political philosophy in the government department to study political theory. And Cornell West was teaching a course, not in my department, on you allowed W.B. Du Bois, as it happens. It's like, I want to take that course. And my department wouldn't give me permission to take it. I got it in the end. I fought. I went, round and round, so forth, and I got it. But anyway, it was, a course that obviously fit my program, and as it happened, it also was directly pertinent to things I was wrestling with. I was talking to a graduate student. Cornell West, this is kind of a crazy story, but Cornell West has just come back to Harvard after having been at Princeton, the Union Theological Seminary, and I was talking to a graduate student last year about the inclusion and belonging work, and said, it's the funniest thing, I'm in sociology, I'm a graduate student in sociology, and Cornell West is teaching this course on W.B. Du Bois, the first African-American sociologist, and my department won't give me credit for taking it. And I was like, you are kidding me! 20 years later, how can that possibly be? And I think it comes down to this issue of head and heart. That is, the concerns I had about criminal justice and race relations and so forth were legitimate research concerns. But my department, they didn't fit within the framework of what had been conventionally taught within the department. And so I think that's what I meant when I said if we actually affirm the notion that you can put head and heart together, we can liberate people to do the intellectual work that they need to do and strengthen the university in the process by expanding its lines of inquiry.
So we have time for one more question, and if I may, as moderator, give that question to Seymour Mansfield. Is there a mic that?
I thought someone there had the mic.
Oh, okay.
I have really appreciated what you had to say, and I'm sort of mentally challenged by all the things that become involved when you start to talk about this. And the other day, I was reading in the New York Times with the legalization of marijuana, and you may have read the article. They were finding that, well, first of all, I was surprised to hear that California supplies something like 30% of the marijuana that's used in the United States.
Yep.
And secondly, none of the growers want to go into the program. They're all refusing to register because they make about 10 times the price by selling it on the black market as they do legally. And I was trying to fit this into what we're saying because theoretically, if we could start with marijuana, although we all know that heroin, meth, fentanyl is like, 4 or 5 times the death rate of heroin. I mean, it's terrible. Mm-hmm. But at least we could start with marijuana, and then we could see how that might change things. But then we also have this deeply embedded buckwheat that is very difficult to get out
Yep.
of the actual profit system of the black market.
The problem is very deep. The problem is very deep. So,
kind of looking to what you thought of that.
yeah, no, it's a deep problem because I can say, and I think we should legalize marijuana and shrink the black market and decriminalize, as I said, cocaine and heroin. And doing so, I think it is necessary to do so. Yet at the same time, it does mean that there are, well-organized organizations whose what they're organized to do is to do illegal things. And by that I mean the cartels in South America and Central America and the distribution points they're connected to. The distribution points in this country are fully equal opportunity. People don't often realize that drug use and drug distribution are like these equal opportunity activities that really all races participate evenly, with the exception of Asian Americans who use at somewhat lower rates than everybody else. Everything else, equal opportunity. And so as an example, when NAFTA went through, Mexican cartels that used to traffic in televisions from the US into Mexico just changed products and entered the drug business. So you take drugs away, it's going to be weapons and probably human trafficking. Okay, so it's not to say that the problem of organized crime and illegal activity goes away, and we have to be self-conscious about that and figure out how on earth to tackle those problems. But my belief is that we can rescue a lot of people from the problem of the black market by taking the narcotics piece out of it and then concentrate our resources on the problems of guns and human trafficking.
So will you join me in thanking Danielle Allen?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
My name is Lois Becker. I'm the Provost and Executive Vice President of Roosevelt University. Again, I want to thank you. Heart, head, you really got us working. And I'm so sorry that President Ali Malek-Zadeh wasn't here because he really would have enjoyed it. But he is close to you in a two-dimensional way. And we'd like to present to you this gift, the Chicago